There were 5 chairs at the long table in the meeting hall of Ridgeline Station, and on the second Tuesday of every month, 5 different people sat in them. Nobody had sat in the same chair twice in 11 years. That was the point. Visitors from the inner worlds always asked who was in charge of the colony, and the answer they got was always the same, delivered with the mild patience of people who had explained it 1,000 times before. Nobody was in charge. The chairs rotated. Whoever had signed up for that month's watch sat down, listened to the week's problems, and helped the room decide what to do about them. Then, 30 days later, someone else sat there instead. Dee Whitfield thought this was either the smartest thing her grandparents' generation had ever done, or the most annoying, depending on the day. Today it was annoying, because it meant that when the western cistern valve froze solid at 5 in the morning, there was no single person she could go and blame for not fixing it sooner. There was only Mara Okafor, standing over her with a headlamp and an expression that said the valve's problems were now, officially, also Dee's problems. "You're doing the thing," said Mara, not looking up from the valve housing. "What thing?" "The thing where you decide a machine has personally wronged you." Dee handed over the wrench Mara was holding her hand out for without being asked, which she was fairly proud of, because 6 months ago she would have handed over the wrong one, and Mara would have sighed in that particular way that meant she was thinking about retirement again. "It has personally wronged me. It's 400 people's drinking water and it picked today to die." "It didn't die. It's cold. There's a difference." Mara was 40 years older than Dee and had spent most of those years with her hands inside some piece of Ridgeline's plumbing, and she talked about the water system the way other people talked about a stubborn relative who came to dinner every week and never once brought anything. Give it heat, give it patience, it'll come around. Same as anything worth keeping. That another one of your water lessons or a general life lesson? Both. That's usually how it works with me. Mara finally glanced up, and there was something almost fond in it, the look of a teacher who had decided, without quite admitting it out loud, that this particular apprentice was going to be good at this. "You did the pressure check before you touched the valve?" "Yes." "You logged it?" "Also yes." Dee held up the little waterproof notebook that lived in her jacket pocket, the same kind every water rotation worker had carried for as long as anyone could remember, because Ridgeline trusted paper more than it trusted batteries. "I'm learning, Mara. Slowly. But learning. Slowly's fine. Slowly's how everyone learns this. I took 2 years before Halvard trusted me with the reservoir gauges, and he made me recheck my own numbers for a year after that." Mara straightened up, wiped her hands on a rag that had stopped being useful for wiping anything about a decade ago, and looked east, toward the ridge, where the sky had gone a color Dee didn't have a word for. Not quite the orange of Corvain's usual dawn glow. Something with an edge to it. "Huh," Mara said. "What?" "Nothing. Storm color, maybe. Wrong season for it, though." She kept looking a half-second longer than the color of a sunrise really deserved, and then shook it off, the way you shake off a worry that doesn't have anywhere useful to go yet. "Come on. Cistern won't fill itself, and Priya wants the greenhouse line up before the bees start moving." Ridgeline sat on a shelf of high ground on the moon Talus, in the long shadow of the gas giant Corvain, which hung permanently over the eastern ridge like a bruised orange the size of a held fist. The colony had been built by people who had left somewhere else after that somewhere else fell apart, and they had built it on a simple principle, repeated so often in Ridgeline's founding charter that children learned it before they learned their multiplication tables. No one person, and no small group of people, should ever again be the single point through which everything had to pass. If a leader failed, or died, or simply made a bad call at the wrong moment, an entire settlement should not fail with them. So there was no mayor. There was no permanent council. There was a rotation, for water, for the greenhouses, for the orchard terraces, for the mine shafts that fed the smelters, for teaching, for the clinic, and everyone who lived at Ridgeline long enough eventually took a turn holding some piece of it. The 5 chairs at the monthly meeting weren't rulers. They were whoever's turn it was to listen hardest that month. This month, the chairs belonged to Mara, for water. To old Thomas Reyes, for the orchard terraces, because he had flown shuttles once and now grew apples with the same care he used to give a landing approach, checking the wind before he trusted the ground. To Priya Anand, for the greenhouses and the beehives that pollinated them, who could tell you the mood of an entire hive from 20 paces by the pitch of the hum. To Colton Vance, for the smelters and the forge, because someone had to speak for the people who worked with fire and knew its patience ran out faster than anyone else's. And to Nadia Voss, the youngest of the 5 at 26, for the school, because the children needed someone at that table who still remembered, clearly, what it was like to be small on a moon this far from anywhere. Dee had watched all 5 of them argue cheerfully about crop rotations 2 nights ago, Thomas insisting the Eastern Terrace needed another season of rest and Colton needling him about apple politics, and thought, not for the first time, that this was possibly the least dramatic form of government in human history. She had no idea yet how wrong that was about to become. The valve gave, finally. With a shudder Dee felt through the floor grating and up through her boots. Mara nodded once, satisfied, logged the fix in her own notebook, and started coiling the heating cable. Dee watched the sky a moment longer than she meant to, the way Mara had. It was the kind of color that made you want to be somewhere with walls. They walked back toward the main corridor together, past the schoolhouse, where Nadia Voss was already herding a line of children through the front door with the particular cheerful firmness of someone who had done this every morning for years and expected to do it for many more. She waved at Mara. Mara waved back. It was, Dee would think much later, an entirely ordinary wave, the kind exchanged between 2 people who assumed there would be a great many more ordinary mornings after this one. You ever think about what you'd do if you weren't on water? Dee asked, mostly to fill the walk. Every rotation, probably. I did 2 years on the orchard when I was your age. Hated grafting. My hands are too impatient for it. Mara glanced sideways at her. Why, you thinking about switching? No. I like knowing where the pipes go. Feels like knowing a secret nobody else bothered to learn. That's most of adulthood, as far as I can tell. Knowing where one particular set of pipes goes, and trusting everybody else to know theirs. Mara said it lightly, the way she said most things, but there was a version of the sentence underneath it that Dee wouldn't fully understand until much later that same day. The ship came down 2 hours later, in full daylight, which somehow made it worse. Night would have made sense. Night was when bad things were supposed to happen. This came down at mid-morning, over the eastern terraces, a long dark hull with a spine of pale light running its length, and it did not fall so much as it arrived, the way weather arrives, unhurried and unstoppable, indifferent to the fact that people below it had breakfasts half-eaten and children walking to the schoolhouse. By the time it landed in the scrub beyond the orchard fence, half of Ridgeline was standing outside looking at it, the way people look at a house fired 2 streets over, too far to help, too close to look away. That's not one of ours, said Yusuf Idris, who ran the vehicle bay and therefore considered himself the colony's foremost authority on anything with an engine. He had a wrench still in one hand from whatever he'd been working on when the shadow crossed the yard, and he held it now the way a person holds an object purely for the comfort of holding something. That's not anyone's I've ever seen, and I've seen every shuttle that's touched this moon since I was 9. Old Thomas came out of the orchard rows at a pace that was fast for him, wiping grafting sap from his hands onto his coveralls, his eyes doing the thing they always did with anything airborne, reading it the way a pilot reads an approach even decades after the last time he'd flown one. Bad angle of descent for anything friendly, he said quietly, mostly to himself. Too controlled. That's a landing, not an emergency. The ramp lowered. What came down, it did not look like people wearing armor. It looked like armor that had decided, as an afterthought, to be shaped roughly like people. Tall, jointed wrong at the knee, skin the grey-green of old copper, moving in loose, disciplined pairs that fanned out from the ramp like water finding the low ground. Their weapons hung ready but not raised, the posture of soldiers who had done this often enough not to need to look eager about it. Dee counted 40 of them before she lost count, which felt like an important number to know and also felt completely useless, because what was she going to do with it? She looked for Priya, found her near the greenhouse fence with 2 of the B-rotation apprentices crowded close behind her, and thought, absurdly, that Priya had the exact same stillness in her body that she got when she was deciding whether a hive was about to swarm. Nobody run, Priya said, quiet and even, more to the apprentices behind her than to anyone else, the same voice she used at the hives when a jacket sleeve came untucked and a person's first instinct was to bolt. Running is what makes a thing decide your prey. One of the apprentices, a boy of 14 named Oscar who spent most of his rotation getting stung despite Priya's best efforts, asked in a very small voice whether the aliens could smell fear the way bees could smell it. I don't know, Priya admitted, but it's a good rule regardless. They didn't fire. Not at first. Small devices rose from several of the front pairs, handheld, humming faintly, sweeping slow arcs across the crowd the way Priya swept her scanner across a hive to check for disease. Dee felt the sweep pass over her like a change in air pressure. It didn't hurt. It didn't feel like anything, except wrong, The particular wrongness of being looked at by something that had already decided what it was going to do with what it saw. Nadia Voss came running from the schoolhouse, out of breath, having left a room of 9-year-olds with the assistant teacher and orders to bar the door, and she reached the meeting hall at almost the same moment Colton did, coming up from the forge still smelling of hot iron. Someone had rung the ordinary bell, the electronic one, the one everyone still trusted that morning, calling for the 5 chairs to convene, because that was what you did when something happened that the whole colony needed a decision about fast, and 11 years of habit did not know yet that it was about to be exploited. Inside, the 5 of them had barely sat down. Mara wanted to talk evacuation routes for the lower terraces, in case the ship turned out to be nothing more than an emergency landing that needed help, not fear. Thomas kept glancing at the door, still reading the ship the way he'd read it from outside, saying he didn't like the angle of that spine of light along the hull. It looked less like running lights and more like something built to be seen and respected from a distance. Colton was quieter than usual, turning a piece of scrap iron over and over in his hands the way he did when he was thinking through a problem the forge couldn't solve for him. Nadia had brought a folded note from the assistant teacher, a simple question in a child's careful handwriting about whether the strange ship was friendly, and she was trying to decide, out loud, what to write back that would be honest without being frightening. "We tell them the truth in small pieces," Priya said. "That's always worked before." "There isn't a small piece of this yet," Mara said. "We don't know anything." "Then we say that. We don't know, and we are finding out, and everyone should stay close to home until we do." Nadia was already writing it down. Kids can hold not knowing better than most adults give them credit for. It's certainty they can't handle. It was, in its own way, an entirely typical Tuesday argument. 5 people who trusted each other enough to disagree without raising their voices, working toward the same plain, careful answer from 5 different directions. Nobody in that room had the faintest idea it was the last conversation 4 of them would ever have. 2 hours after the ship landed, the meeting hall doors were kicked in. Everyone assumed, later, that the invaders had been reading something: heat signatures, electrical patterns, the specific gathering of 5 particular people in one specific room at one specific hour, because that had been exactly the wrong hour to have a meeting, and exactly the wrong 5 people to have it with. The aliens moved through Ridgeline's main corridor in a straight, certain line, past the clinic, past the school, past 40 other people who could have told them nothing useful about anything, straight to the long table with the 5 chairs, as if they already knew precisely who they were looking for and precisely where to find them. Which, Dee understood only much later, was exactly what had happened. The colony's communications relay, open, unencrypted, the way Ridgeline kept everything, because nobody had ever felt the need to hide from anyone, had spent 11 years broadcasting, in the plainest administrative language, the schedule of who sat in which chair and why. To anyone listening from orbit with the right kind of patience, it had read like an organizational chart. 5 names. 5 roles. 5 targets. The invaders believed, with the flat confidence of an army that had done this before on a dozen other worlds, that they had just found humanity's chain of command. What the invaders did not know, because no signal in the galaxy could have told them, was that the org chart was a lie of convenience. Not a deliberate lie. Nobody at Ridgeline had ever needed to think of it that way, but a lie all the same, the kind that happens when a simple label gets pinned onto something too complicated to explain in a hurry. The 5 chairs sounded like leadership. They functioned like a rain gauge. They measured what the colony was already doing. They didn't decide what the colony did next. Every single adult at Ridgeline, and most of the older children, had at some point in the rotation held a piece of the responsibility that outsiders assumed belonged only to whoever happened to be in a chair that month. Dee herself had spent 4 months on the water rotation under Mara, learning valves and pressure gauges and the particular stubbornness of pipe that had frozen and thawed too many winters in a row. Before that, she'd spent a season in the greenhouse rotation, learning which of Priya's bees were the calm ones and which ones held a grudge, and a summer helping Colton at the forge, mostly by staying out of his way and fetching things. Every child at Ridgeline grew up being handed a small, real job, and every adult grew up trusting the child holding it, because the alternative, waiting for someone official to show up and tell you what to do, had killed people once, a long time ago, on a colony none of Ridgeline's founders liked to talk about at length. That colony had had a mayor. A good one, by most accounts, competent and well-liked, right up until the reactor breach that killed her along with both of her deputies in the first 90 seconds. There had been no one left who knew the evacuation protocols in enough detail to act fast, because the mayor's office had kept them, out of habit and no particular malice, close to the mayor's office, in files most people had never once needed to open. 300 people had died waiting for someone with the authority to tell them to run, in a colony that had never meant to build itself that way and had simply drifted into it, one convenience at a time. Ridgeline's founders had rebuilt themselves out of that lesson like a bone that heals stronger at the break. No single point of failure. Ever again. It was written into the charter, and it was written into the school lessons, and it was written, mostly, into the way people were simply raised, to assume that whatever job was in front of you was yours to do, whether or not anyone official was there to hand it to you. Dee had heard the story of that old reactor breach exactly the way every child at Ridgeline heard it, in the school's founding history lesson, told without much drama because the founders had decided early on that drama was the wrong tool for teaching this particular lesson. What she remembered most from it wasn't the number of dead, which was too large to feel like anything but a number, but a smaller detail the teacher always included, that 300 people had died standing in corridors they knew perfectly well how to walk, because none of them had ever been handed the specific piece of paper that gave them permission to walk down those corridors without waiting to be told. It was, Dee had thought even as a child, an almost unbearably stupid way to die, and she suspected that was exactly why the founders had kept telling the story that way. Not to frighten anyone. To make the stupidity of it impossible to forget. Which meant that on the day the invaders killed Mara Okafor and Thomas Reyes and Priya Anand and Colton Vance and Nadia Voss in the meeting hall, quickly, with the practiced economy of a strike team eliminating a command structure, the water system did not stop. The greenhouses did not stop. The orchard terraces, the forge, the school, none of it so much as paused, because none of it had ever depended on those 5 people being alive to keep functioning. It had only ever depended on everyone else already knowing how. Dee did not know any of this in the moment. In the moment, all she knew was that she had been in the vehicle bay helping Yusuf when the first screams came down the corridor, and that when she reached the meeting hall doorway, Mara was on the floor, and the room smelled like burnt copper, and there was a strange humming quiet where 5 voices should have been arguing about apple yields. She would think, later, about a small brass bell that hung in the vehicle bay rafters, one that old Sam Okonkwo, a retired miner who had never fully trusted anything with a battery in it, had insisted on keeping wired to a hand crank instead of an electronic siren, because, in Sam's words, electronics failed exactly when you needed them not to. Everyone had tolerated it for years as an old man's stubborn habit, something you smiled about at the equinox drills and forgot about the rest of the year. Nobody, until that hour, had understood why it mattered that the whole colony had grown up knowing exactly what that bell's pattern meant. But that came later. In the meeting hall doorway, Dee understood only one thing. Mara was not going to explain the frozen valve to her again, and there was a very specific, very small silence where that explanation should have been. Grief, at Ridgeline, did not have a chance to sit still, and that turned out to matter more than anyone could have planned for. Yusuf found Dee still in the doorway and did not let her stay there. He put his hand flat on her back, the way he did when a piece of machinery was about to be handed to someone shaking too hard to hold it steady, and he said the only thing he had, which was, "The pumps still need running." Not because he didn't care. Because he did, and because he had learned a long time ago on a moon this unforgiving that grief and duty had to be carried in the same 2 hands, or neither one got carried at all. Old Ben Calder, who had spent 30 years blasting rock in the eastern shafts and knew more about the physics of a controlled explosion than anyone else on Talus, was already moving people away from the corridor and toward the storm shelters cut into the ridge, shelters built originally for the moon's violent equinox winds, never once used for anything else, stocked with supplies nobody had touched in a decade, their seals cracked open now for the first time by hands that remembered the drills even if nobody had ever expected to use them for this. Ruth Okonkwo, the colony's only doctor, had 4 wounded from the initial sweep and no idea yet how many more were coming, and she was already triaging on instinct, calling for anyone who had ever spent a season on the clinic rotation to come help hold pressure on a wound. 6 people came, because 6 people had done exactly that, at some point in their lives, and had never really stopped being the kind of person who would. Nobody waited for someone to tell them what to do next. There was no one left whose official job that had ever really been, and there had never truly been anyone whose job that was in the first place. What there was, instead, was 400 people who each knew one true, useful thing, and who had spent years learning to trust the person next to them to know a different true, useful thing, and to act on it without being asked twice. Dee found herself back at the Western Cistern within the hour, hands shaking so badly it took her 3 tries to seat the pressure gauge correctly, doing the only job she was certain of, because the water still had to move whether or not the world had just ended around her. She kept the valve open. She kept the pressure steady. She did not know, doing it, that this was the first small proof of something the invaders were about to learn the hard way, that removing 5 names from a chart did not remove 400 hands from 400 tasks. Across the colony, in those same 6 hours, the same quiet, stubborn pattern repeated itself without anyone organizing it on purpose. In the Eastern Mine, the shift foreman for the week, a soft-spoken woman named Griot who normally spent her days worrying about air quality readings, moved every miner she could reach into the deepest gallery and sealed the outer doors from the inside, because she had run the equinox drills every year of her working life and the drills did not care whether the emergency outside was weather or something worse. In the smelter, 2 apprentices Colton had trained bank the furnace fires low rather than letting them run wild and unwatched, because Colton had taught them, over and over, that an unattended forge was its own kind of disaster, invasion or no invasion. In the schoolhouse, the assistant teacher kept 22 children calm with the oldest trick available to her, which was simply continuing the lesson, multiplication tables recited in a small, steady voice while outside the windows the sky did things none of their textbooks had a chapter for. None of it was coordinated. None of it needed to be. It was 400 separate people doing 400 separate things they already knew how to do, each one certain enough in their own small corner that they didn't need to wait for someone to tell them the corner still mattered. Up on the ridge, the alien commander, a narrow, patient officer named, in its own tongue, something that translated loosely to adjudicator Vresh, reviewed the strike's outcome with the calm satisfaction of a professional watching a familiar process complete itself. 5 command signatures eliminated, cleanly, with minimal resistance. Colony Administrative Center secured. Standard doctrine, refined across 11 prior first contact engagements on 11 different worlds, called for a settlement's coordinated resistance to collapse within 6 to 10 hours of a successful decapitation strike, replaced by scattered, disorganized panic that a modest occupying force could contain with ease and very little further bloodshed on either side. Vresh gave the order to advance a holding patrol down into the colony proper, to begin that containment before panic could curdle into anything more dangerous than fear. 6 hours later, that patrol had not reported in. The patrol had walked into the orchard terraces expecting frightened civilians and had instead found Ben Calder, who did not consider himself a soldier and had never once used that word about himself, but who understood 2 things very well: rock, and the exact amount of force required to move it without bringing down more than intended. He had spent the 6 hours since the meeting hall packing the drainage culverts beneath the terraces, narrow stone channels built to carry runoff during the equinox floods, wide enough for a person to crawl through and reach every terrace level from underneath, with the same mining charges he used to open new shaft faces. Small, precise, not designed to kill from a distance, because Ben didn't have anything designed to kill from a distance. Designed to bring down exactly enough loose terrace wall to turn 8 meters of open ground into a landslide with legs still standing in it. Thomas worked beside him without being asked, moving grafting knives and pruning shears from the equipment shed into the hands of anyone who came looking for something sharp, and quietly directing 3 of the younger orchard workers to positions along the upper rows where the light would be behind them and their footing would be solid. He had never given an order to another human being in his life that carried more weight than mind the wind on your final approach, but the habits of 30 years of flying, of reading terrain and timing and the small margins that separated a safe landing from a disaster, turned out to translate to ground combat more usefully than anyone would have guessed. The patrol crossed the terraces at the hour Ben had guessed, because it was the hour that gave them the best light and the worst wind, and the terraces came down around them in a controlled roar of soil and stone that the invaders' senses had no category for, because it did not register as a weapon. It registered as geology. 4 of the patrol went down under the slide. The rest scattered, disciplined even in surprise, and found themselves in the narrow lanes between orchard rows, where Thomas's grafting knives, kept sharp enough to split a branch cleanly without bruising the bark, because a bad graft wasted a whole season of careful work, turned out to work on other things too, in the hands of orchard workers who had spent years learning exactly where to cut for the least resistance and the most effect. It was not a clean fight. Nobody there would ever describe it as clean. It was close and frightened and over faster than any of them expected, because the invaders had planned for panic and found instead people who had simply kept doing their jobs, with tools built for other purposes, on ground they knew better than their own hands, in light they had spent years learning to read. One of the invaders, half buried and struggling under loose terrace soil, managed to level a weapon at Thomas as he passed. Thomas didn't run. He'd spent 30 years learning that the worst thing you could do on an unstable approach was panic and overcorrect, and some instinct older than fear kept his hand steady as he brought the flat of a pruning spade down across the weapon before it fired, the same unhurried economy of motion he used to guide a branch into a graft. "Sorry about your morning," he said to the alien afterward, and meant it, in the strange, exhausted way a person can mean something and still not stop doing what needs doing next. A second soldier broke from the slide and ran for open ground, and it was Oscar, of all people, 14 years old and normally allergic to standing still, who tackled him into an irrigation ditch simply because the boy happened to be standing in the only place the soldier could run to, and had been taught since he was 7 that when something came at you fast, you didn't wait to be told what to do about it. Afterward, in the ringing quiet that follows any fight that ends faster than the body expects it to, Ben walked the terrace checking his own charges for anything that hadn't fully settled, out of the same habit that made him double-check a shaft face long after the blast was over. Thomas gathered the fallen weapons into a pile, turning one over in his hands and finding no trigger anywhere he expected one, only a smooth pressure pad where a trigger guard should have been. He pressed it, carefully, angled toward open ground, and watched a section of terrace wall vanish in a line of blue light thin enough to have come from a scalpel rather than a rifle. He set the weapon down very gently after that, the way a person sets down something they have just realized is far more dangerous than it looked. "We keep these," Ben said. "Whatever they are." "We keep them," Thomas agreed, "and we figure out how they work before we trust anyone carrying one." When Adjudicator Vresh reviewed the report, the word that kept recurring in the sensor logs was one its translation system struggled to render precisely. The closest human approximation was unauthorized. Combat effectiveness without a corresponding command signature. Coordinated defensive action with no directing intelligence the scanners could locate anywhere within the engagement zone. Vresh did not yet understand that there was no directing intelligence to locate, because on Vresh's 11 prior worlds, there always had been. Somewhere. Even hidden ones eventually revealed themselves under enough pressure, because someone always had to give the order, sooner or later, and that someone could always be found and removed. Vresh's doctrine had a specific answer for this kind of anomaly. Intensify the strike, widen the sweep, find the node that was still issuing instructions and remove it too, however deeply buried it appeared to be. Vresh had, in effect, found what looked like a false victory for the colony and mistaken it for a problem still waiting on a solution one decapitation away. The doctrine was not stupid. It had been built the same way most durable things are built, out of 11 separate successes on 11 separate worlds, each of them proving the same pattern. Find the minds that decide, remove them cleanly, and a population organized around obedience will spend its remaining strength waiting for someone new to obey, giving an occupying force all the time it needs to secure the ground. On a world called Icena, a planetary council of 9 had fallen in under an hour, and the resulting silence had lasted 3 full days. On a moon Vresh's own translator still filed under a designation meaning roughly the quiet one, a single hereditary administrator's death had ended all organized resistance before nightfall. Vresh had commanded that operation personally, and had felt, if such a word applied to Vresh's kind at all, something close to pride in how efficiently it had gone. None of those worlds had ever taught Vresh what to do with a population that had already decided, generations before Vresh's ship ever left home orbit, not to have a mind that could be removed in the first place. That was the mistake that turned a contained skirmish into a war. The second wave came before dawn, and it did not come as a patrol. It came as a third of Vresh's remaining force, moving in a broad arc meant to encircle the colony's core and cut off the terraces, the mine, and the school from each other, so that whatever node was coordinating them could be isolated and identified by process of elimination, section by section, until nothing was left standing that could plausibly be giving orders. This was the hour Ridgeline came closest to breaking. The invaders' weapons were better than anything the colony had. Their armor turned aside blades and blunt tools that would have stopped a person twice over. They moved with a discipline built from doctrine refined across a dozen worlds, and they did not hesitate the way the colonists sometimes did, in that first raw second before a decision, because they had never had to grieve anyone that morning, and the colonists had. Ridgeline had. 5 people by the meeting hall, and by the time the sun cleared the ridge, 9 more besides, among them 2 of the 6 who had answered Ruth's call to the clinic and never made it back from carrying a wounded neighbor across open ground. Ruth kept working through all of it, because that was the one thing she knew how to do that mattered more than grief did, and because Mara had been one of the first bodies brought to her, and Ruth had made herself a single promise in the 10 seconds she allowed herself to stand over her old friend before turning back to the living, that whatever else happened today, she would not lose anyone she still had a chance to save. She said it to no one. She simply kept moving, hands steady, voice level, calling instructions to volunteers who had never held a suture needle before that morning and would never quite think of themselves as ordinary colonists again after it. Dee was at the western cistern when the second wave reached the water rotation section of the colony, and she was alone, because everyone who could fight or carry or dig had already gone toward the terraces to help Ben's people hold what was left of the line. She had one wrench, a valve control panel she knew better than her own bedroom, and absolutely no training in anything that resembled combat, and for one long moment she stood very still and let herself be exactly as frightened as the situation called for. Then she thought about Mara's hands, steady on a frozen valve at 5 in the morning, and about being told, more than once, that patience and pressure were the same lesson wearing two different names. What she had, it turned out, was the thing she'd learned from Mara without ever being told she was learning it, that the water system was not just pipes. It was pressure. It was leverage. It was 400 people's worth of stored, moving force, and Dee had spent 4 months learning exactly how to control where that force went, and exactly how much of it there was to spend. She opened the pressure release on the reservoir line above the cistern approach, the one Mara always warned her never to open fast, because the runoff channel below it could move a grown man off his feet if he wasn't braced for it, and she opened it as fast as the valve would turn, and 11,000 litres of stored mountain runoff came down the channel in a wall that took the lead pair of the approaching patrol clean off the path and into the ravine below. Armour and all. It did not stop the second wave. Nothing Dee did alone was going to stop a third of an occupying force. But it bought 40 minutes, and it kept her section of the colony from being flanked, and when Ben's people fell back from the terraces under weight of fire they could not match, they fell back to ground Dee had already made impassable to anyone who didn't know the water system's secret geography as well as she did, geography that existed nowhere on any map the invaders could have scanned, because it lived only in the memory of the people who had walked it. Ben himself was among the last off the terraces, half carrying Oscar, whose leg had taken a graze from an energy bolt close enough to cauterize the wound as it made it, which was the only reason the boy was still walking on it at all. They came down through the same runoff channel Dee had just flooded, ankle deep in cold water that was still draining toward the ravine, and Ben allowed himself, for exactly one breath, the thought that they had lost the terraces, lost too many people already, and might lose everything else besides. Then Oscar asked him, teeth chattering, whether the orchard would still be there in spring, and Ben found he did not have room left in himself for anything but answering that question honestly. "It'll be there," he said. "Might need some replanting. It'll be there." It was, in its small way, the same thing every person doing every job across the colony that morning was quietly deciding, one exhausted breath at a time, without ever discussing it as a group, that whatever ground had been lost, the rest of it was still worth holding, and holding it was still their job to do, with or without anyone left to assign it to them. 40 minutes turned into the time it took for someone to remember the bell. Sam Okonkwo had been sitting in the vehicle bay rafters for 6 hours, not out of cowardice but because he was 71 years old and half-deaf, and Yusuf had told him, not unkindly, that his best contribution to the day was making absolutely sure the one piece of equipment that couldn't be jammed still worked when it was needed most. The invaders had, in fact, been jamming everything else since the first hour. Ridgeline's comm relay had gone from a useless liability that broadcast the colony's schedule to open space, to a piece of dead static the moment Vresh's ship established its own signal dominance overhead. Every handheld radio in the colony had been reduced to hiss and silence, which meant that when the western cistern held and the terraces fell back and half of Ridgeline needed to know, in the same instant, to converge on the dam control station above the reservoir, the one piece of infrastructure that, if it fell, would let the invaders cut off water to the entire colony and starve out whatever resistance was left, there was exactly one way to tell them. Sam rang the bell. It was not a subtle sound. It was not meant to be. It carried down the ridge and into every corridor and terrace and mine shaft at Ridgeline in a pattern every person there had known since childhood without ever having a real reason to use it. 3 long, 2 short, repeated. The signal for all hands, dam station, now, drilled into every equinox season child for 11 years against a storm that had never once actually threatened the dam, practiced so many times it had become almost a joke. The kind of thing older kids teased younger kids about pretending to take seriously. It threatened it now, and nobody who heard it needed the joke explained to them twice. They came from everywhere at once, and that was the thing Vresh's forces had no doctrine for. Not reinforcements arriving on someone's order. Not a chain of command redirecting its available units section by section. Just 400 people who had heard the same 3 and 2 pattern their whole lives and did not need to be told what it meant, converging from a dozen directions on a single point, each of them arriving with whatever tool their morning had put in their hands, smelter tongs still warm from the forge, grafting knives, lengths of irrigation pipe, the last of Ben's mining charges, a doctor's surgical clamp turned makeshift weapon, a 17-year-old with a wrench and 11,000 litres of moving water still roaring in her memory. Vresh's forces, still spread wide in their encirclement pattern, found themselves suddenly facing a colony that had, in the space of a single bell signal, stopped being scattered and become concentrated exactly where it needed to be, without a single order having been given to make it happen. Colton came up from the forge with tongs still hot enough to smoke where they brushed against dry grass, and behind him came 4 apprentices he'd never officially trained for anything except metalwork, carrying anything with an edge that had come off his workbench in the last year. Ruth left the clinic in the hands of the 2 steadiest volunteers and ran the whole distance to the dam with a case of dwindling medical supplies, because she had already decided, without being asked, that wherever the worst of it happened next, that was where she needed to be. Oscar arrived out of breath, having outrun 2 adults twice his age, and nobody told him to go back, because there was no longer time to argue about who was old enough for what, only about who was standing where. Sam kept ringing the bell long after the first colonists had already reached the dam, because he had no way of knowing who was still out of earshot, and because the sound itself, once it started, seemed to be doing something to the invaders below almost as much as it was doing something to the colonists converging on the ridge. To 400 people, it meant come now. To Vresh's forces, watching their sensors light up with dozens of new contacts appearing from a dozen directions with no warning and no visible coordination, it meant something closer to we do not understand what is happening, and Doctrine had very little useful to say about that feeling. The fight for the dam station lasted less than 20 minutes. It felt, to everyone in it, like several hours. The dam control station sat on a shelf of rock above the reservoir, a squat concrete building Thomas had once landed a shuttle beside, back when shuttles still came and went from Ridgeline with any regularity. It held the valves that fed the cistern system, the sluice gates that kept the equinox floods from taking the terraces, and, that morning, 6 of Vresh's soldiers, who had reached it first, on Vresh's direct order, and dug in with the calm confidence of a force that expected reinforcement long before it expected resistance. Ben Calder's people arrived with the last of the mining charges, and Ben himself did something he would later insist was not brave, only obvious. He crawled the drainage culvert beneath the station, the same kind of narrow stone channel that had brought down the orchard terraces, built into every piece of Ridgeline infrastructure by the same founders who had never trusted a single point of entry, and came up inside the station's lower level while every alien eye was fixed on the colonists. Advancing across open ground outside, drawn forward by the noise and the light like moths that had simply been given the wrong reason to move. Dee reached the station's outer wall at nearly the same moment, soaked to the waist and shaking with cold and adrenaline in roughly equal measure, and found Yusuf already there with a length of irrigation pipe in each hand, because Yusuf had decided somewhere in the last hour that if the invaders' weapons could cut through armor plate, they could probably also be made to short out against enough scavenged copper wire shoved into the right access panel, and he was, as it turned out, entirely correct about that. "You good?" he shouted, not really expecting an honest answer. "No," Dee shouted back, already moving toward the panel he pointed at. "But the valves are good, and that's what matters right now." What followed was not elegant. It was 400 people's worth of small, individually unremarkable competence, arriving all at once, in the same place, at the same overwhelming moment, a mining charge collapsing a supply corridor exactly where Ben knew the structure would fold rather than kill anyone caught near it. Ruth's clinic volunteers dragging wounded colonists clear while Priya's beekeeping assistants, of all people, turned out to have the steadiest hands in the colony for threading wire into a live panel without flinching, the same steadiness that let them work a hive without gloves. Dee, back at a valve control she understood better than anyone alive now that Mara was gone, flooding the station's lower level just enough to short every piece of electronics that wasn't sealed, because she had learned, without ever meaning to, exactly how much water it took to do that and not one drop more, and exactly how much was too much. It was not a fair fight, and it was not won by force. It was won because 6 soldiers with superior weapons had never had to hold a position against 100 people who each knew one small, precise thing about the building they were standing in, and who trusted, without discussion, that the others knew theirs. Colton reached the upper doorway just as one of the defenders turned a weapon on the first colonists through the breach, and he did the only thing his hands knew how to do under pressure, which was close the distance fast and use the tongs the way he'd used them 10,000 times at the forge, not as a weapon exactly, more as an extension of his own reach, closing them hard around the weapon's barrel and wrenching it wide a half-second before it fired. Ruth was 3 steps behind him with a field dressing already unwrapped, moving toward the nearest fallen colonist before the room had even finished going quiet, because triage, to Ruth, had never waited for a fight to be officially over. By the time the last offender went down, the lower level was ankle-deep in water and dead electronics, the upper level smelled of scorched copper and forge smoke, and the sluice controls, the actual thing worth fighting over, sat untouched and fully intact in Dee's hands, exactly where they had been the entire time. Yusuf found her still crouched at the panel afterward, soaked through, her fingers white-knuckled around the same wrench she'd carried since the cistern. "You held it," he said, not quite a question. I held it. Dee's voice came out steadier than she felt. Mara would have opened the second valve sooner. I hesitated. You held it, Yusuf said again, more firmly this time, crouching down beside her so she'd hear him over the ringing in both their ears. That's the whole job. Hesitating half a second and still doing it right is the same as not hesitating at all, far as the water's concerned. He held out a hand and pulled her up. Mara taught you that too, probably. She just never got around to saying it in those words. Outside, the last of the invaders' encirclement had scattered back toward the ship, and for the first time in nearly a full day, no alarm was ringing anywhere on the ridge. Vresh, watching the engagement collapse from a ship above, reviewing sensor logs that showed no directing signal, no command node, no single point that, if struck, would make the resistance stop, reviewing, in short, a colony that appeared to be fighting as a single coordinated organism while displaying no leadership structure whatsoever, no signature anywhere in 11 campaigns worth of doctrine that matched what the sensors were showing, did something it had not done in any of those 11 prior campaigns. It hesitated. The message that came down from Vresh's ship an hour later did not go to any one person, because there was no one person for it to go to, and the invaders had, by then, begun to understand that in a way their doctrine had never once accounted for. It went, instead, to the open channel, the same open, unencrypted channel Ridgeline had always broadcast on, the one that had first told Vresh where to find 5 names and 5 chairs. This time what came back across it, once Sam or Conquo got the relay working again with a spliced cable and a great deal of muttered profanity, was not an org chart. It was simply everyone who could reach a working terminal, all speaking, none of them claiming to speak for the rest, all saying some version of the same thing. You are not welcome here, and you have not won. Vresh requested, through the translator, to speak with whoever now held authority over the colony's response, phrasing the request with the flat patience of an officer who still, after everything, expected the answer to be a name. The answer took a while to compose, because 17 different people wanted to help write it, crowded around Sam's terminal arguing gently about phrasing while Ruth changed dressings on 3 wounded arms at the same table, and in the end it was Dee who typed it, not because anyone had appointed her, but because her hands were the ones already on the keyboard when the room finally agreed on the words, and nobody thought to take that job away from her. Nobody holds it, she typed, reading it aloud as she went so the room could stop her if it was wrong. That's the whole point. You killed 5 people who were listening that month. Everyone else already knew what to do. Vresh did not answer that immediately. Sensor sweeps continued for another hour, searching, out of 11 campaigns worth of habit, for the hidden structure that had to be there, because doctrine insisted structure was always there somewhere, if you look hard enough and patiently enough. It found orchard rotations and clinic rotations and a water schedule written in the same plain administrative language it had once mistaken for a target list, and none of it pointed anywhere in particular, because none of it was ever supposed to. When Vresh finally responded, it was with a single, careful question, translated with the stiff precision of a system built for treaties between governments, not conversations between strangers. If there is no one who commands, it asked, then who do we address to end this? The room around Sam's terminal went quiet for a moment. It was Griot, still soot-streaked from the mine, who answered first, leaning over Dee's shoulder to speak into the relay. You don't address anyone to end it, she said. You just stop. That's the whole procedure. There isn't a second step. Ben, arriving late with a bandage on one forearm and mining dust still in his hair, added a shorter version of the same idea, the closest thing to a threat anyone in the room let themselves make out loud. You keep looking for the person to surrender to, you're going to keep finding 400 of them, and every single one is going to say the same thing Griot just did. Vresh asked one more question before it went quiet again, and it was, of everything the translator produced that day, the one line Dee would remember most clearly for the rest of her life. How do you decide anything, it asked, if no one is permitted to decide? Nobody in the room had a tidy answer for that. Ruth finally offered the closest thing to one, still working on a patient's arm as she spoke, not looking up from her stitches. Whoever's holding the problem decides. Then the rest of us trust them to have decided right, and we help. Next time it's someone else's turn to hold it. She tied off the last suture and only then glanced toward the terminal. It's slower than one person deciding everything. It just doesn't ever stop working all at once. The withdrawal order came at dusk. It was not, strictly, a surrender. Ridgeline had not defeated an army, and everyone there knew it, knew that a larger, less patient force could have simply burned the colony from orbit and asked no questions at all. What Vresh withdrew from was not a battle it had lost, but a doctrine that had failed to apply, a strike meant to remove a head from a body that, as far as its instruments could determine, did not have one, and would not, no matter how many times it was struck, produce the collapse its doctrine promised, because the doctrine's most basic assumption had simply never been true here. The ship lifted at first dark, the same unhurried, unstoppable way had arrived, and this time 400 exhausted people stood in the open and watched it go, and nobody cheered, because there were 5 people, and by the day's end 14, who would not be standing there to watch it with them. They buried 14 people on the 3rd day, in the ground beyond the orchard fence where Ridgeline had buried its dead for 11 years, in a plot nobody had ever needed to make larger than it was. Mara went into the ground beside the reservoir she had spent 40 years learning to listen to, and Dee stood at the edge of the crowd with a wrench she hadn't let go of since the dam station, because she hadn't been able to think of anywhere else to put it that felt right. There was no eulogy from any single person, because that had never been how Ridgeline said goodbye to anyone. Instead, there was a long, uneven procession of small stories, offered by whoever stepped forward and wanted to offer one, about a valve someone had fixed, or a graph that had finally taken after 3 failed attempts, or a hive that had swarmed once, and how Priya had talked the whole panicked crowd through standing still until it settled on a fence post instead of a person. Nadia's stories came from the children, in their own small, careful handwriting, read aloud by the assistant teacher because none of them were quite old enough yet to trust their own voices not to break in front of everyone. Colton's came mostly from the people he trained, who stood together near the forge side of the crowd and did not say very much at all, because some kinds of grief were better held with your hands busy than with your voice. Ben spoke last, not because anyone had decided he should, but because the silence had gone on long enough that somebody needed to, and it turned out to be him. He talked about rock, oddly, about how a mountain didn't collapse all at once even when you took a piece out of it, how the rest of the structure simply redistributed the weight until it found a new way to stand. He wasn't sure, he admitted, whether that was a good metaphor or a strange one to use over a grave. Nobody minded either way. It was, everyone agreed afterward, exactly the kind of thing Ridgeline would say about itself. Dee visited the western cistern that evening, alone, and sat for a long time beside the valve she'd flooded a channel from 2 days earlier, the metal still cold under her palm the way it always was, the way it had been the morning Mara taught her to check the pressure before touching anything. The moon's long dusk stretched purple and gold over the ridge, Corvain's bruised orange glow rising behind it the way it did every single evening, entirely unconcerned with what had happened underneath it. She did not cry, exactly. She sat with the valve, and checked the pressure, and logged it in the little waterproof notebook, because the water still needed watching whether or not the person who taught her to watch it was there to check her numbers, and because doing the thing Mara had taught her, in the exact careful way Mara had taught her to do it, felt like the only conversation she had left to have with her. They set 5 chairs at the long table again the following month, on the 2nd Tuesday, the way they always had. Nobody suggested changing that. A few people suggested, quietly, that maybe it was time to stop broadcasting the rotation schedule on an open channel, and that suggestion passed without much argument, and the charter was amended by the following spring. But the 5 chairs stayed empty that month, and the month after, and every 2nd Tuesday since. Not because Ridgeline had gone back to needing someone in them. The rotation still turned. New names still took up water and orchard and greenhouse and forge and school, the same as always, the same as it was built to. But the room kept 5 chairs empty at every meeting from then on, set at the table like anyone else's, unfilled, a quiet fact everyone in the room simply lived beside without needing it explained out loud. Dee sat in one of the working chairs herself. Eventually, years later, the month it was her turn for water. She remembered, sitting down, a frozen valve on an ordinary morning, and a woman handing her a wrench without being asked for it, trusting that Dee already knew which one to take. She still didn't know, some mornings, whether that trust had been wisdom or simple stubbornness, refusing, generation after generation, to let any single failure, a reactor breach on a world none of them had ever seen, or a strike team that knew exactly where 5 names would be sitting on a Tuesday morning, take the whole of anything down with it. She only knew that when the ship had come, looking for someone to cut the head off, it had found 400 hands instead, each one already knowing its own small piece of the whole, and none of them waiting for permission to use it. The empty chairs weren't a memorial exactly. Nobody at Ridgeline ever quite settled on the right word for what they were. But they stayed at the table, every 2nd Tuesday, unfilled and undisturbed, a small and stubborn reminder that the thing the invaders had come to kill had never been sitting in those 5 seats in the first place. It had been sitting in every other seat in the room, and in every terrace and shaft and greenhouse beyond it, the whole time, and it still was. Ben Calder came to that same meeting, the one where Dee finally sat in the water rotations chair, and afterward the two of them walked back toward the ridge together in the long orange dusk, the way half the colony seemed to end up doing most evenings, for no better reason than that the walk was pleasant and Corvain's light made even an ordinary evening look like something worth noticing. "You did fine in there," Ben said. "Didn't talk too much. Didn't talk too little. High praise, coming from you. I don't hand it out where it isn't earned." He was quiet for a few paces, hands in his pockets, looking out at the terraces where the orchard had long since grown back over the ground his charges had once brought down. You ever wonder what would have happened if they'd landed somewhere else? Somewhere with a mayor, like our old story. One good building to hit, one signature to erase, and that's the whole fight decided before anyone else even wakes up. "I try not to," Dee said. "Doesn't change anything that it worked out different here." "No, it doesn't." Ben glanced sideways at her, the same look Mara used to give her over a valve panel, the look of someone deciding a person had gotten a hard lesson right without being told twice. Still worth being grateful somebody, a long time before either of us, decided not to build it that way. They didn't say much else the rest of the walk. There wasn't much else that needed saying. Behind them, back in the meeting hall, the long table sat exactly as it always did, 5 working chairs filled for another month, 5 more set quietly, deliberately, beside them, empty and waiting for absolutely no one, because that had never been what they were for.